There's something subtle that's been happening in your life lately, and it's easy to overlook. Not loud, not dramatic, not the kind of thing people point out. But you've probably felt it. Moments where you pause a little longer than usual. Conversations that don't land the same way anymore. Situations that once felt normal now feel slightly off. And you can't fully explain why. It's not that everything is falling apart. It's more like things are quietly rearranging themselves. And today, we're not here to hype it up or label it something extreme. We're just going to talk about it honestly, because ignoring this shift doesn't stop it. It just makes it harder to understand. When your old self stops making sense, there comes a point where you look at your own habits and feel disconnected from them. Things you used to enjoy don't hit the same. The way you used to react feels unfamiliar now. It's not always dramatic. Sometimes it shows up in small ways. You scroll through things that once entertained you and feel nothing. You're in conversations, but mentally you've already stepped back. You hear yourself agreeing with people, but internally something doesn't align anymore. This isn't confusion. It's awareness catching up. A lot of people assume growth feels exciting all the time. But in reality, it often feels like losing connection with parts of yourself you once relied on. And that can feel uncomfortable, because now you're in between versions of yourself. Not who you were. Not fully who you're becoming either. That space can feel quiet, unfamiliar, even isolating. But it's not a mistake. It's a transition. Why you've been pulling back from certain people. You may have noticed something else too. You're not as available as you used to be. Not because you're trying to distance yourself intentionally, but because certain interactions feel heavier now. Conversations that used to feel normal now feel repetitive. Energy that didn't affect you before now drains you faster. And you might even question yourself. Am I changing too much? Am I overthinking? Why does this feel different now? But here, the grounded reality. Your awareness is becoming more selective. You're starting to notice patterns, tones, and intentions that you once overlooked. And once you see something clearly, it's hard to go back to not seeing it. That doesn't mean people around you are wrong. It just means you're perceiving things at a different level now. And that naturally changes how you engage. Not with judgment, but with distance. The quiet shift in your priorities. Another thing that doesn't get talked about enough is this. Your priorities don't always change loudly. Sometimes they shift in silence. You start valuing peace over constant stimulation, clarity over approval, depth over distraction. And from the outside, nothing looks different. But internally, everything is reorganizing. You may find yourself saying no more often, needing more time alone, questioning things you used to accept without thinking. This isn't you becoming distant. It's you becoming intentional. And that can feel unfamiliar at first, because it requires letting go of automatic behavior. You're no longer just reacting to life. You're starting to choose how you respond to it. Why this phase feels lonely, but isn't negative. Let's be honest about something. This stage can feel isolating. Not because you don't have people around you, but because fewer people seem to understand what's happening internally. You try to explain it, but it comes out unclear. You feel different, but can't fully describe why. So instead, you stay quiet about it. And that silence can feel like distance. But hear the grounded truth. You're not alone. You're just in a phase where your internal world is evolving faster than your external environment. And that creates a temporary gap. That gap isn't permanent. It's part of recalibration. You're learning how to connect again, but from a more aligned place. When you start questioning everything, at some point the shift gets deeper. You don't just question habits or people. You start questioning your own thinking patterns. Why do I react this way? Why do I seek validation here? Why does this situation affect me so much? This is where real change begins. Not when you change what's around you, but when you start observing what's happening within you. And that can feel intense, because now you're not just experiencing life. You're analyzing it, understanding it, breaking it down, and rebuilding your perspective piece by piece. That's not overthinking. That's awareness expanding, the moment you realize you can't go back. There's a subtle but powerful realization that happens during this process. You can't go back to being unaware. You can't unsee what you've understood. You can't unknow what you've realized. And that can feel frustrating at times, because staying the same would be easier, less complicated, less uncomfortable. But growth doesn't work like that. Once your perspective shifts, your entire experience of life shifts with it. And even if you try to go back to old patterns, they won't feel natural anymore, because you've already outgrown them. What this transformation is really about. This isn't about becoming someone completely different overnight. It's about becoming more honest with yourself, more aware of your patterns, more intentional with your energy, more aligned with how you actually want to live. It's not loud. It's not performative. It's internal. And it shows up in the way you think, the way you respond, the way you choose. You're not losing yourself. You're refining yourself, if any part of this felt familiar. Not dramatic, not overwhelming, just quietly accurate. Then you're probably already in this shift. There's no need to label it. No need to rush it. Just pay attention to it. Because the more aware you become of what's changing, the easier it is to move through it with clarity instead of confusion. And if you want to share your experience, what's been changing for you lately, even in small ways, you can talk about it below. When you stop explaining yourself as much, something else begins to change quietly, and you might not even notice it at first. You stop feeling the need to explain everything. Before, you might have over-clarified your decisions, tried to make sure everyone understood your intentions, spent extra time justifying why you chose a certain path. Now you pause, not out of frustration, but out of clarity. You start realizing that not every decision needs to be translated into something others can approve of. And that realization feels freeing, because you're no longer shaping your choices around how they will be perceived. You're making them based on what feels internally aligned. That doesn't mean you've become closed off. It just means you've become more grounded. The difference between RESTING and RESPUNDING. There was a time when everything felt immediate. Someone said something, you reacted. Something didn't go your way, you felt it instantly. Situations controlled your mood more than you realized. But now there's a gap. A small pause between what happens and how you respond. And in that pause, something powerful exists. Choice. You start noticing that not everything deserves your energy. Not every situation requires your reaction. Not every opinion needs your attention. This doesn't make you passive. It makes you aware. Because you're no longer operating on autopilot. You're choosing your responses instead of being driven by impulse. Why certain environments feel different now. Places you once felt comfortable in may start to feel off. Not necessarily bad. Just misaligned. It could be a social setting, a familiar routine, even spaces you used to enjoy being in. At first, you might think nothing has changed, but something has. You have. Your tolerance for certain environments shifts when your awareness shifts. You begin to notice the atmosphere more clearly. The conversations, the energy, the patterns, and instead of forcing yourself to fit into those spaces, you start questioning whether those spaces still fit you. That's not rejection. That's recognition. When your inner voice gets louder, there's a moment in this process where your internal voice becomes harder to ignore. Not louder in volume, but clearer in direction. You start catching yourself mid-decision, mid-thought, mid-pattern, and something inside you gently interrupts. This doesn't feel right. This isn't necessary. You've outgrown this. It's not aggressive. It's calm but persistent. And the more you listen to it, the more accurate it becomes. Because that voice isn't random. It's built from your awareness, your experiences, and your evolving perspective. It's you paying attention to yourself. The discomfort of outgrowing, your own patterns. One of the most challenging parts of growth isn't external. It's internal. It's realizing that some of the patterns you've been living with came from you. Not circumstances. Not other people. You. And that realization can feel uncomfortable because it removes the excuse of staying the same. You start seeing habits that no longer serve you, reactions that no longer make sense, loops you've repeated without questioning. And now you're aware of them, which means you have a choice. Continue repeating them, or start changing them. And change, even when it's positive, doesn't always feel easy. It feels unfamiliar. Why you're becoming more selective with your time. Time starts to feel different during this phase. Not in a dramatic way, but in a more intentional way. You begin to notice how certain activities leave you feeling drained, while others leave you clear and focused. And naturally, your choices start shifting. You might spend less time in things that don't add value, less time in conversations that feel repetitive, less time chasing things that don't align anymore. Not because you're trying to control everything, but because you're becoming more aware of what actually matters to you. And once you see that clearly, your time reflects it. When you stop chasing constant validation, there was probably a time when external feedback mattered more than you realized. Approval, recognition, being understood. And there's nothing wrong with that. It's part of being human. But now something shifts. You still appreciate support, but you don't depend on it the same way. You don't need constant reassurance to trust your decisions. You don't need everyone to agree for something to feel right. Because your reference point is changing. It's moving inward. And that creates a different kind of confidence. Not loud. Not performative. Just stable. The subtle building of self-trust. All of these small changes lead to something deeper. Self-trust. Not the kind that shows up instantly, but the kind that builds quietly over time. Every time you listen to your intuition. Every time you choose alignment over comfort. Every time you respond instead of react. You reinforce something internally. I can trust myself. And that's powerful. Because once you develop that, you don't second-guess every step. You don't hesitate as much. You move forward with a sense of clarity, even when things aren't fully certain. The shift from external control to internal stability. At some point, you start noticing a bigger change. You're less affected by things you can't control. Situations still happen. People still behave unpredictably. Life still moves in ways you didn't plan, but your internal state stays more stable. Not perfectly calm all the time, but less reactive, less shaken, because you're no longer trying to control everything outside of you. You're focusing on how you show up within it. And that changes everything. If you've made it this far, you've probably recognized pieces of your own experience in this. Not perfectly, but enough to pause and think. And that's the point. This isn't about labeling yourself or forcing change. It's about noticing what's already shifting and understanding it better. So if you've been going through changes like this, subtle or clear, you can share that. Not for validation, just to reflect it when you realize you're not who you were anymore. At some point, the shift becomes undeniable. It's no longer just small changes in behavior. It's a deeper recognition. You're not the same person you used to be. And not in a dramatic, overnight way, but in the way you think, the way you process things, the way you see yourself. You start remembering how you used to react. And it feels distant. Not wrong, just outdated. And this can bring mixed emotions. Because even if you've grown, there's still a sense of letting go. Letting go of a version of yourself that once felt familiar. And that's not always easy. The strange feeling of outgrowing, your past. There's a moment where your past starts to feel like something you've stepped out of. Not erased, not denied, but no longer defining. You might revisit old memories and notice how differently you interpret them now. Things that once felt important don't carry the same weight. Situations that once affected you deeply now feel more neutral. And it's not because those experiences didn't matter. It's because you've changed your relationship with them. You're no longer living inside those moments. You've moved beyond them. When clarity starts replacing confusion. Earlier, everything might have felt unclear. Too many thoughts, too many questions, too many internal contradictions. But slowly something settles. Not all at once, but gradually. You start understanding your own patterns, your triggers, your decisions, and instead of feeling overwhelmed by them, you begin to navigate them. Clarity doesn't remove challenges. It just makes them easier to face. Because now you understand what you're dealing with. The shift from seeking to building. There was a phase where you were searching, looking for answers, looking for direction, trying to understand what was happening. But now that energy starts shifting. You're not just seeking anymore. You're building habits that align with you, building a mindset that supports you, building a way of living that actually feels right. And this is where things become real. Because awareness without action stays abstract. But once you start applying what you've learned, that's where transformation becomes visible, when you become comfortable with your own space. Solitude starts to feel different. It's no longer something you avoid. It becomes something you value. Not because you want to disconnect from people, but because you've learned how to connect with yourself. You don't need constant noise to feel okay. You don't need constant distraction to feel occupied. You can sit with your thoughts and not feel overwhelmed. That's growth. Because being comfortable alone doesn't mean being isolated. It means being stable within your own presence. The realization that growth is continuous. One of the most grounding realizations in this entire process is this. There is no final version of you. No point where everything is completely figured out. No moment where growth stops. And instead of feeling frustrating, that realization becomes freeing. Because it removes pressure. You don't have to rush. You don't have to force everything into place. You don't have to become perfect. You just have to keep evolving, step by step. When you start living more intentionally, this is where everything begins to come together. Your choices become more deliberate, not forced, not rigid, just intentional. You think before you commit your time. You reflect before you react. You choose what aligns instead of what's convenient. And over time, these small decisions shape something bigger. A life that actually reflects who you are becoming, not who you used to be. So let's pause for a second. Not to overanalyze everything, but to recognize something simple. If you've been feeling these shifts, the distance from old habits, the change in how you think, the awareness of your patterns, then you're already in the process. You don't need a label for it. You don't need to rush it. But you also shouldn't ignore it. Because the more conscious you become of your own growth, the more control you have over where it leads. And here, where this becomes real. Don't just watch this and move on. Take a moment after this video ends and actually reflect. What has changed in you recently? What no longer feels aligned? What are you starting to see more clearly? Not in a dramatic way, just honestly. And if you're willing to put it into words, share that in the comments. Not for attention, but because sometimes putting your thoughts into language makes your awareness stronger. And if this kind of grounded, real conversation is something you want more of, stay connected to this channel. Because we're not here to overwhelm you with noise. We're here to help you understand what you're already experiencing with clarity.